It was the mid-70s South. Thousands filled the Coliseum, waiting for Elvis to sing. But just before the band hit the next note, Elvis froze. In the crowd, he had spotted a woman alone, holding a photograph against her chest. If stories like this move you, make sure to stay with us until the end, because what Elvis did that night went far beyond music. The show began like any other Elvis concert in the mid-70s, explosive. The house lights dropped. The first notes cracked through the speakers. A wave of screams rolled from the back row to the stage like a storm. Elvis appeared in his signature rhinestone-studded white jumpsuit, the spotlight catching every glint. Sequins flared under the beams, reflecting onto the audience like tiny sparks. The smell of popcorn and hairspray hung thick in the air. Programs rustled. People leaned forward, waiting for the king to deliver. Halfway through the set, Elvis was in his rhythm hips, moving voice booming, scarves flying to the front row. He wiped sweat from his brow with one, tossed it into the crowd, and the lucky fan clutched it like treasure. Everything seemed in sync. The band tight, the crowd electric. Elvis feeding off their energy, but then he noticed something that broke the flow. Among thousands swaying and clapping, one figure stood out. A woman sat stiff in her chair, motionless. No hands in the air. No singing along. Just stillness. In her lap, she held a small photograph pressed close against her chest. Her head bowed slightly as if protecting it. Ushers nearby glanced at her, unsure if she needed help. Elvis's voice faltered for just a fraction of a beat. Most didn't notice, but those close enough saw it. He missed nothing. He never did. The band carried on, guitars ringing, horns cutting through the air. But Elvis's eyes were fixed. Witnesses later said you could see the change in his expression. The performer vanished, and the man stepped forward. According to reports, the woman was a widow, recently bereaved. That photograph in her arms wasn't just paper, it was her husband's face. She had come alone, holding on to him the only way she could. Elvis stood straighter, one hand gripping the mic stand tighter than before. The roar of the crowd blurred around him. For that moment, all he saw was her grief, sitting in the middle of joy. The song neared its end. Elvis glanced at the band, subtle but firm. He raised a hand, palm open. The musicians slowed. A puzzled murmur spread through the arena. Then, with a nod, he signaled. Stop. Guitars silenced. Drums cut. Brass hung in the air. The sudden quiet crashed harder than the music. The crowd hushed, thousands leaning in. The only sound left was the faint hiss of the amps and the echo of Elvis's breathing. Through the microphone, every spotlight in the room seemed brighter in that silence. And still his eyes never left hers. This was no longer just a concert. Elvis slowly turned back to the band and motioned again, signaling them to fade, completely leaving the Coliseum in a silence so heavy. You could hear people shifting in their seats. The silence was jarring. 1 second, the band was in full swing. The next, every instrument was dead. The sudden break rippled through the audience like a shockwave. Murmurs rose. Heads turned. Thousands of fans tried to understand why the king of rock and roll had just stopped mid-show. Elvis didn't flinch. He stayed planted at the edge of the stage, microphone in hand, his eyes steady on the woman in the crowd. His chest rose and fell, amplified by the mic's faint crackle. For a performer known for commanding chaos, this pause felt heavier than any note he had ever sung. Then the spotlight shifted. Slowly, deliberately, it swung from Elvis's shoulder to the section where she sat. The beam found her, a woman, clutching the photograph tighter now that the arena's eyes were upon her. The crowd gasped, a single sound carried by 10,000 throats. The woman shook her head slightly, as if to refuse the attention. She raised a trembling hand, almost as if to wave the spotlight away. But Elvis leaned down, lowering his microphone, and pointed gently in her direction. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Around her, fans leaned back in their seats, giving her space. Ushers froze, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment unfold. A young girl sitting a few seats away later recalled, "It was like the whole place stopped breathing." Everyone waited to see what Elvis would do next. Elvis walked slowly toward the very edge of the stage, one hand holding his scarf, the other gripping the mic stand. He lowered himself to one knee, breaking the barrier between stage and audience. In that instant, the king looked less like a legend and more like a man reaching out. The woman pressed the photograph to her heart. Her shoulders shook. The spotlight revealed her face streaked with tears. People nearby whispered to each other, realizing she wasn't just a fan overcome by the show she was grieving. Elvis tilted his head, expression soft but unyielding. He extended his hand, scarf draped over it, offering not just a token but an opening. The microphone caught his breath as he spoke. His voice was steady but low. The single word rolled through the sound system and into every corner of the arena. The woman froze. The crowd sat in perfect stillness, thousands straining to hear what came next. Then Elvis leaned closer, bringing the mic just enough to his lips so the audience could hear. His words were simple, direct, and disarming. "Ma'am, may I?" The question hung in the air. A star at the height of his fame, asking permission from a grieving stranger. Every fan in the arena leaned forward, desperate to know her answer. The arena was frozen. Thousands leaned forward, waiting for her response. The widow clutched the photo tighter, her knuckles pale in the spotlight. For a moment, it looked like she might shrink into herself, refuse. But then slowly she nodded. A small, broken gesture. Permission given. Elvis exhaled, almost in relief. He stood, turned to the band, and gave a simple nod. The drummer raised his sticks, ready for the next upbeat number. But Elvis shook his head. The guitarist looked puzzled until Elvis mouthed the words, "Love me, tender." The first gentle chords filled the air. Not the roar of horns or the drive of bass, just a soft guitar, fragile and exposed. The sound rolled out like a whisper through the giant Colosseum. The contrast was startling. Elvis lifted the microphone again, but this time his stance changed. He didn't square his shoulders to the entire arena. He angled his body toward her. His gaze stayed locked on the widow in the third row. And when he began to sing, it wasn't to the thousands. It was to one, "Love me tender, love me sweet." The words, so familiar to fans, suddenly felt different. They weren't lyrics. They were comfort. His voice dropped lower, intimate, each syllable wrapped in gentleness. Gasps turned into sniffles. You could hear it, the crowd realizing what was happening. He wasn't performing. He was offering. The woman's lips trembled. Witnesses later recalled she whispered her husband's name as Elvis sang the opening lines. The photo shook in her hands, catching the spotlight for a second. The glossy surface flashing like a star for the rest of the arena. That image burned into memory. Elvis Presley, the world's biggest star, singing not to them, but to a grieving widow and the man she had lost. A few fans lifted their cameras, but most lowered them just as quickly. This wasn't a moment to capture, it was one to feel. The air itself seemed to thicken with grief and grace. Halfway through the song, Elvis's voice softened even further. The microphone barely caught it, yet every person swore they could hear. Some said the room itself carried his words, bouncing them across every wall so no one missed a line. The widow's tears spilled freely now, tracking down her cheeks in streams. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs, yet she didn't look away. She stared straight back at Elvis, as if the song was the only thread keeping her standing. Then came the moment that would be retold for decades. The woman raised the photograph, lifting it high enough for those around her to see. The spotlight caught it again, clear and undeniable, a portrait of her late husband in uniform. The arena gasped. What had begun as one woman's silent grief became a shared revelation. Elvis's voice did not break, but his eyes glistened under the lights. He kept singing, his words falling over the widow, over the photo, over the thousands who now felt they were part of something sacred. Love me tender, love me true. People in the upper levels stood, not in applause but in reverence. Couples held hands tighter. Strangers reached for tissues. It was as though the entire Colosseum had been pulled into the widow's lozenge. Elvis had decided they would carry it with her. Then came the shift. Elvis moved. Still singing, he stepped away from center stage. One foot lowered off the platform, then another. The crowd gasped again, thinking maybe he was ending the show early. But he didn't head backstage. He headed toward her row. Security stiffened, hands to their earpieces, unsure. But Elvis ignored them. His focus never broke. With the microphone in one hand and the scarf in the other, he made his way down the steps, every spotlight following. By the time the final chorus began, Elvis was no longer on stage. He was walking straight into the audience, moving toward the grieving widow, his voice echoing over the stunned silence of thousands. Elvis moved slowly, down from the stage, each step deliberate. The spotlights tracked him, beams cutting through the haze of cigarette smoke that floated in the Colosseum air. The crowd, once roaring, now sat frozen in awe. The only sounds were his voice and the faint shuffle of his boots on the steps. Security tensed immediately. A guard near the aisle reached out, but Elvis waved him off with a simple gesture. It wasn't aggression. It was calm authority. The message was clear. Let me pass. And they did. The song never stopped. His voice carried steady, but lower now, almost a whisper over the speakers. Fans close to the aisle leaned back, giving him space. Hands reached out instinctively, but no one dared grab him. They knew something sacred was happening. Elvis walked into the third row and stopped just feet away from the widow. She looked up through her tears, clutching the photograph against her chest as though it might shield her from the moment. He extended his hand, the white scarf draped loosely across his fingers. His eyes locked onto hers, not the audience, not the cameras, not the lights. Just her. The band's gentle chords filled the silence between them. Elvis knelt, lowering himself until he was level with her seat. Thousands of fans craned their necks, straining to see. Witnesses later said you could hear the faint crackle of the mic as he inhaled. So close, it picked up even his breath. For one verse, he sang inches from her. His words poured directly into the small space they shared, echoing through the sound system but belonging only to her. Love me tender, love me dear. The widow broke. Her shoulders collapsed forward, tears streaming openly. She reached out with both hands and clasped his. Between them, the photograph pressed against his palm. A wave swept through the arena. Fans wiped their eyes, some sobbing openly. A man in the upper level recalled, decades later, "It was like we all lost someone that night. We were crying with her." Elvis's voice did not falter. His jaw tightened, eyes shining, but the lyrics carried on. His grip on her hands was steady, grounding. He didn't let go. When the verse ended, he gently placed the scarf in her lap. Then, leaning closer, he pressed his forehead to hers for a brief, second and unscripted human gesture. The arena gasped, then fell into a silence so deep, you could hear people's breathing echo in the rafters. The song reached its final lines. Elvis pulled back, just enough to meet her gaze again. Her lips moved, whispering something no one else could hear. And then it happened. He leaned forward and whispered back. The microphone dropped to his side, cutting off the sound. Whatever words he spoke belonged only to her. The crowd strained, desperate to know, but the secret stayed between them. For the widow, it was personal. For the world, it was a mystery. The final chord rang out, held by the band as Elvis slowly rose. He released her hands with care, as though he was setting something fragile back in place. She clutched the scarf and photo together, rocking slightly as if to steady herself. The Colosseum erupted sobs, mixing with applause, an emotional release unlike any encore. Yet in that roar, the only two who remained completely still were Elvis and the widow. As the music faded, Elvis bent down one last time and whispered something into her ear, words swallowed by the noise. To this day, no one knows what he said. The final note of "Love Me Tender" lingered in the air like smoke, hanging longer than anyone expected. The band held it, waiting for Elvis's cue. When he finally lowered the mic, silence returned, but only for a heartbeat. Then the arena erupted. It wasn't the usual rock and roll frenzy. This was different. A standing ovation roared through the Colosseum, waves of applause colliding with sobs. Some fans clapped furiously, others pressed tissues to their faces, and more simply stood in stunned silence, hands trembling. It was less celebration and more release. Elvis didn't bask in it. He remained by the widow's side, steadying her as she lowered back into her seat. She still clutched the scarf and photo together, holding them like sacred relics. His hand lingered on her shoulder for a second longer than expected. A final touch before he stepped back. He leaned down once more, pressed a gentle kiss against her forehead, and whispered again private words, lost under the thunder of applause. Witnesses closest to her swore she nodded, tears flowing even harder after he pulled away. Only then did Elvis turn toward the stage. He climbed the steps slowly, as though the weight of what had just happened pressed heavy on his shoulders. Fans near the front swear his eyes were wet. He raised a hand to his face, quick and subtle, but the gesture said everything. Back on stage, he stood still, gazing over the crowd. The band looked to him, waiting. He gave a small nod, signaling them to continue. But when the music picked back up, it didn't feel the same. The energy had shifted. Every lyric, every note, carried a heaviness that wasn't there before. Elvis sang as if every song for the rest of the night was dedicated not to fame, not to performance, but to grief, love, and memory. The audience responded in kind. There was less screaming, less chaos. Instead, fans leaned into one another, holding hands, swaying together. A communal moment had taken root, one that transcended entertainment. Midway through the next number, ushers quietly approached the widow. With a nod from her, they helped guide her out of the row. She rose slowly, scarf pressed to her heart, photograph still clasped in her hands. As she walked up the aisle, something remarkable happened. The fans around her parted, stepping aside as though she carried something holy. People reached out not to grab, but to touch her arm, to offer comfort. The widow didn't speak. She just walked forward, head bowed, the scarf trailing over her arm. By the time she reached the exit, half the arena was watching her go. Elvis didn't stop the music this time. He let her leave, his eyes following her from the stage until she disappeared from view. For most, that would have been the end of the story. A powerful night, unforgettable. But for her hand, for Elvis, it wasn't over. Because a week later, something arrived on her doorstep that would turn this moment into legend. The night of the concert ended, but for the widow, the memory lingered. She returned home with the scarf draped across her lap, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of Elvis's cologne. The photograph of her husband, now creased from her grip, rested beside it. For most, it would have been more than a noofa once-in-a-lifetime encounter. But a week later, her doorbell rang. According to reports, she opened the door to find a delivery man standing with a long package. No sender name, just her address neatly typed. She signed without question, curiosity overtaking her grief. Inside her living room, she set the box on the table. The cardboard was plain, taped carefully, almost ordinary, but her hands trembled as she pulled at the seams. Something about the weight, the shape, it felt intentional. When the flaps opened, she froze. Inside was a guitar, a sunburst Gibson, polished to a shine, its strings glinting in the afternoon light pouring through her curtains. She reached in carefully, as though lifting something sacred. Resting against the body of the guitar was an envelope. She slid it open. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold, slanted, familiar from the records and posters she had seen for years. Elvis Presley. The note was brief, just a single line. Your husband's seat will always be saved. Elvis, her knees buckled. She sat back, clutching the letter with shaking hands. Tears welled, spilling over as she pressed the note to her chest. The scarf and photograph still lay on the table, and now the guitar joined them, a trinity of memory, grief, and kindness. Word of the gesture spread quietly at first. Family members told the story. Neighbors repeated it. Then fans began to hear whispers. Elvis hadn't just comforted her that night, he had reached into her home, acknowledging her pain beyond the stage. For her, the gift was never about the value of the instrument. She never sold it, never flaunted it. According to relatives, it stayed in her living room, resting in its case like an heirloom. What mattered wasn't the guitar, it was what it meant. It was proof that her grief had been seen, validated, honored by someone the world called untouchable. For the fans, the story became legend. Proof that Elvis wasn't only an icon, but a man who noticed the unseen, who carried the weight of strangers as if it were his own. And yet, as powerful as the gesture was, it begged one final question. How would the world remember this act? Decades later, when Elvis himself was gone. Because what started as a single moment between a grieving widow and a superstar would soon echo far beyond that concert. How becoming part of Elvis's enduring legacy.